Today in Edge of Eternities, we get an enchantment that lets each player play things for free, a ridiculous reanimating uncommon, Urza at home, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Edge of Eternities spoilers. So I know it's Saturday, but we got a few cards to talk about today. Not a super big spoiler day, but some pretty interesting stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it and finish wrapping up week 1 of spoiler season. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Edge of Eternities. First up today, we get a new blue mythic in Weftwalking, and I gotta say this card has some of the most spectacular art from the entire set. I absolutely love this art. Unfortunately, the card itself might not be quite as spectacular. So Weftwalking, a 6-mana blue enchantment. It says when it enters, if you cast it, shuffle your hand and your graveyard into your library, and then draw 7 cards. And then the first spell that each player casts during each of their turns may be cast without paying its mana cost. So if you think about Weftwalking, it's basically like a time spiral, but only for you. You also don't get to untap your lands, but 6 mana, you wheel everything away, shuffle everything, and get a new hand, mixed with a 1 with the multiverse, but a 1 with the multiverse for both players. You get to cast a free spell during your turn, your opponent gets to cast a free spell during their turn. The biggest issue with this card, and we'll get into this more as we go along, but the way it's worded, if you just cast Weftwalking fairly during your turn, it's going to be your first spell, which means you don't get a free spell during your turn, which then means your opponent's going to be the first player to get the free spell, and that might be a deal breaker for Weftwalking. So let's start with the bad news of Weftwalking, and then we'll talk about the ways that we could possibly make it work. So first off, the card's not that above the curve, right? If you think about what it is, we have, like, card draw wise, Overflowing Insight, 7 mana draw 7, no one plays it. We have Step Between Worlds, a 5 mana wheel effect for both players, no one really plays it. So to actually make this card work, you don't just need the card draw effect. You need the card draw effect, and then you also need to somehow break the parity of the each player gets to cast a spell for free, and that's what really scares me. As I mentioned before, the biggest concern I have for this card is the fact that if you play it fairly, your opponent gets the first spell. And to illustrate why this is the problem, it reminds me a little bit of Marlin of the Morn Song. If you don't know Marlin, it's this 3-drop legend that makes it so players can't draw cards, but then at the beginning of each player's draw step, they essentially just tutor and lose 3 life. So the thing about Marlin is, you think, okay, it's going to be cool. I'm going to play this. No one gets to draw. Everyone gets to tutor. The problem with Marlin is you play this, your opponent's going to tutor first, and your opponent can just tutor up an answer to Marlin and kill it, and you never get any value out of it. Weftwalking could have the same issue, where you cast this fairly during your main phase. Yeah, you get to draw a bunch of cards, but if your opponent just untaps and casts a free spell that blows up the Weftwalking, or some big bomb that wins them the game, having all the cards in the world is not going to help you, because remember, you can only cast the free spell as your first spell during your turn, so you can't, like, draw 7 cards and then cast a free counter to counter what your opponent plays for free. So that's the biggest issue with this card. So how can we actually break this card? And I think there's a few ways to think about this. So in one hand, it could work like Show and Tell. If you think about Show and Tell, Show and Tell is another symmetrical effect, where for 3 mana, each player gets to put something into play from their hand. And the theory of building around Show and Tell is, you got to build your deck around it, your opponent didn't. So your deck's going to have all these big Emeralds and Griselbrands. Your opponent's theoretically not going to have those cards. So yes, even though both players put something into play for free, you're going to get way more value out of it, because you're putting an Emrakul into play, your opponent's putting their best card into play, but it's not going to be anywhere near as good as an Emrakul. So maybe Weftwalking can work like that, where yes, your opponent's going to get free value, but if your opponent's playing, I don't know, mono red aggro, what's the worst thing they can realistically put into play off this card? A 2-drop Slickshot Show Off? You could probably handle that, especially if you're going to untap and play a free Velgavoth or a free Summon Bahamut or some massive bomb to take over the game. It can also just be good depending on situations. Like if your opponent's empty-handed and you're playing some control deck, you're probably fine, right? Sure, your opponent can get a free spell, but if they don't have any cards in hand, how much damage can they really do casting spells for free? When you're going to have 7 cards in hand, so you're definitely going to have lots of action to put things into play. So those are a couple ways that this card could work. You still have a big consistency issue though, right? You can't trust that you're going to play against mono red. You can't trust that your opponent's not going to be playing Yuna, summons and have their own summon Bahamut, and Weftwalking just makes you lose the game on the spot. Other possibilities for this card: if you can flash it into play, it gets way better. That's probably the easiest way to break your opponent gets to cast the first free spell aspect of this card. In Standard, we have High Fate Trickster, which just like you cast things as if they had flash, so you can wait to your opponent's end step, and then Weftwalking, draw a new hand, untap, you get to cast the first free spell. That actually seems kind of powerful, so maybe there could be some flash deck build around this. Once you get back to older formats, there's also some spells that just keeps your opponent from casting the free spell. So Vexing Bauble counters anything if no mana was spent to cast it. Your stuff too. Lavinia, Boromir just counter your opponent's stuff. So maybe these cards could make it work. Still, if Weftwalking was more above the curve, I would be more excited about like trying to build around it, but it's still 6 mana. You're still kind of getting like a overflowing insight effect, which is a super bustive card. If this was like a 3-mana enchantment, you were like getting a ton of value out of it, it might be more worth building around it. But these are some of the things to keep in mind. With Vexing Bauble, I know it's awkward that it counters your own things, but you can always just sack it when you want to cast a big spell. So preventing your opponent to cast a free spell could be another way to build around this. As far as Commander is concerned, I think there's a couple potential homes for this card. So one is Jin Gataxias, gonna counter the first spell your opponent plays. So you kind of get around the downside. Sure, they cast it for free, but if it's getting countered anyway, not really a big deal. We already talked about Lavinia being a combo with this card, so those decks could want this. The other thing you can do is just play it as like this crazy chaotic group hug card where you're like, all right, you're gonna cast free spells, I'm gonna cast free spells, but if you're playing King and T or Miss Bumbleflower or Feldegriff, some deck that's about giving your opponent resources, then I think Weftwalking is perfectly fine. So Weftwalking, my guess is that this card is basically unplayable. That is my guess. I feel like it's probably not going to be played anywhere. I expect it to be a bulk mythic, although as we talked about, there are some cool build around shenanigans for the card, so maybe there's some like combo or very specific deck that can make it work. But honestly, I'm kind of skeptical of giving my opponent free spells. There's just so many ways it can go wrong. We also got a new blue rare in Mimion the Right Hand, which is a 5-mana 3/4 legendary jellyfish advisor. It is flying. You can look at the top card of your library at any time. You can cast artifacts from the top of your library. And artifacts you control have tap to make a blue. Spend this mana to only cast spells from anywhere other than your hand. So Mimion, kind of an interesting card. It's essentially Mystic Forge on a creature mixed with, I guess I'd say fixed Urza. It kind of has Urza's tap an artifact to make mana ability, except you can only spend Mimemion's ability on stuff that you're casting off the top of your deck if you're casting stuff from exile somehow. So it's kind of like a safe, fair version of Urza Lord High Artificer. So this card, I think it's fine. We've seen Mystic Forge be very good. We've seen Urza very good. So maybe a worse version of those effects would still be pretty good. As far as Standard's concerned, I don't really see this as a card designed that much for Standard, although if it's going to work in Standard, it's probably some Simulacrum Synthesizer, Thousand Moon Smithy deck, where you're just overloaded on artifacts. You can play this as a Mystic Forge to get card advantage, playing things off the top of your deck, and even turn your artifacts into extra mana in some scenarios. So you could play it as like a 1-of or a 2-of in the artifact deck. The biggest issue is the artifact deck really wants everything to be artifacts to trigger its Simulacrum Synthesizer, to grow its construct tokens. So there is a pretty big cost to playing a non-artifact creature in the deck, so that might be a bit of a problem, but maybe a sideboard option in the artifact deck. In older formats, especially Commander, which is where I think this card is designed for, the comparison here is Urza, and I've seen some people say, well, Mimemon is a fair Urza, so if you have an Urza deck in Commander, but you're always archenemy, you can switch over to Mimemon, and this is like bracket 2 Urza. It's a fair Urza. Maybe I won't get hated on so much. I don't think this theory is actually going to work, though, because yes, Urza's really busted. It is a game changer, but the problem is artifacts are just kind of busted anyway. So if you're a mono blue artifact deck, whether you're playing Mimemon or whether you're playing Urza, I'm still probably going to have to target you in a game of Commander, because yes, your Commander's part of it, but I just know the rest of your deck is going to be really explosive and really busted if you're an artifact deck. So I don't think it really gets around the arch enemy hate. So I think if you're playing an artifact deck, yeah, brackets are a concern, maybe you play Mimemon, but really if you're going to go artifacts, you almost might as well just embrace that you're going to be arch enemy and play Urza, and I just try to fight through all the hate rather than try to power down your deck, because I think you're still going to get hated on anyway. There is some combos with Mimemon, which is typically the Sensei's Divining Top combos. If you haven't seen these combos before, Sensei Divining Top, it's an artifact. You can tap it to draw a card and put it on the top of your deck. So if you have a cost reduction effect like Ethereum Sculptor, Foundry Inspector, this makes Sensei's Divining Top free. So with Memenion out, you can just draw your entire deck. You tap top to draw a card, put the top on top of your deck, cast it for free from the top of your deck with Memenion, do it again, do it again. So you draw your entire deck, get a huge storm count, win the game somehow. And it's nice that you start with one of the combo pieces in the command zone. So I think if you're going to build around Memenion, I expect that the top combo probably going to be one of the most powerful things you can do. I think the real home for this card, though, is just jamming it in the 99 artifact decks. In artifact decks, I already like Mystic Pizza Oven a lot. Playing off the top of the deck's really powerful, and in this case, the mana ability can be very powerful as well. So I think if you're playing like Brea or Urza or Joyra, I think this is just a fine member of the 99, even though it's not an artifact, just because he has so much synergy with the rest of your deck. So Memenion, kind of like Fair Urza, I'd be surprised if it did too much in Standard, but maybe the Simulacrum Synthesizer decks. Otherwise, cool combo commander and good in the 99 of various commander decks. We also got a new white aggro creature in Sunstar Chaplain. So a 2-mana 3/2 human cleric. It's at the beginning of your end step. If you control 2 or more tap creatures, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and then you can pay to remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control to tap target artifact or creature, and it's a 3/2 for 2, which is actually fine base stats, like in some sort of aggro deck. So Sunstar Chaplain, I think this could be a fine option in some sort of aggro deck. We've seen some like Boros aggro decks with a Recruitment Officer and Voice of Victory and Lightning. This just seems like another like on curve 2-drop that you can play in the deck. And if you're aggro, you're going to be tapping things to get it into combat, and then you get some counters, and then maybe you like remove a counter to tap down a blocker or something at some point. Paying 2 to remove a counter, not something you want to do a ton, especially in the early game. You'd rather be dumping your hand to creatures. But once you've kind of emptied your hand in an aggro deck, it is a nice mana sink ability where you can use it to get a blocker out of the way, or if things are going bad, tap down an attacker. So I do think it's a nice upside. Going to be way easier in a dedicated counter deck. If you're just leaning on Sunstar Chaplain, like you would be in like a white aggro deck, you might not have enough counters to make it good, but in a dedicated counter deck, that ability can kind of pop off. What I really like about this card, though, is it synergizes with some mechanics that can tap down creatures without putting them in combat. So we're heading into a standard with Station, and Station wants you to be tapping down your creatures to put charge counters on your planets and on your spacecraft. In a deck like that, it seems pretty easy to just tap a couple creatures to Station, and then you start getting counters on your end step, and then eventually you can use it to tap down your opponent's other creatures. So it seems like a good Station card. Same thing also works with vehicles. Maybe we see some sort of mono white vehicle deck where you can play this as a beater, and then once you aren't able to keep beating with it, you can tap it down to Voyaging Glide Car or Unidentified Hover Ship to still get the counters, and then eventually tap down your opponent's stuff to close out the game. So Sunstar Chaplain, I don't think it's like a staple level card, but in some sort of white aggro deck, maybe a vehicle or station deck, or a +1/+1 counter deck, it seems like it's on curve enough that I could see it being part of an actual standard deck. So it doesn't seem like a staple to me or anything, but it does seem just like a fine curve filler type creature that has a bunch of weird little synergies with different archetypes. As far as lower rarity cards, got a few we're shouting out today, starting with Rescue Skiff. So Rescue Skiff, a 6-mana spacecraft. When it enters, you can return target creature enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then you can station it. Once you get up to 10 or more charge counters, it becomes a 5/6 flyer. Also worth noting, it doesn't say if you cast it, so this is blinkable. If you can blink this a bunch of times, you can just keep reanimating things, which is actually kind of cool. So Rescue Skiff, we got a few reanimation effects in Standard in white right now. We got One Last Job, we got Emerge from the Cocoon, Repair and Recharge, currently seeing play as Omniscience Reanimation, although it's going to be rotating, so maybe this could be a new Omniscience Reanimation piece, although 6 mana is kind of a lot to reanimate Omniscience, so it's a little bit more expensive than the other options that we've seen in Standard recently, but it kind of makes up for this in 2 ways. So one is you can blink it, which is a nice little synergy, or bounce it back to your hand with a Nurturing Pixie or something. So that's one upside compared to like a sorcery. The other upside is it does turn into kind of a big creature, and one of the tricks you can do with this is you just reanimate something big like a Velgavoth or a Summon Bahamut, and then you can just immediately tap it, get a ton of charge counters on the rescue skiff. So if you can use what you reanimate to turn this into a 5/6 flyer, if you think about it, a 5/6 flyer, the ETBs reanimate something for 6 mana is actually a pretty good card. So I don't think this card's like a staple, but I can't shake the idea that there might actually be a home for this in some sort of Reanimator deck in Standard. We also have, speaking of Reanimator, oh my god, one of the best cards in the entire set. This card is so incredibly good. Seedship Broodtender. So this is a 2-mana Golgari 2/3 Insect Citizen. When it enters, you mill 3 cards, and then you can pay 5 sack it to reanimate a creature or a spacecraft only as a sorcery. So Seedship Broodtender, this card's kind of like a Velgavoth Faithful, except you're paying a bit more mana on it, because it's also kind of an Aftermath Analyst or a Town Greeter, one of these graveyard filling cards. And when you add that together, I think this card is going to see play in a lot of different graveyard decks. It's already one of the best self-mill cards that we have, just based on rate. A 2-mana 2/3 that mills 3 is already on par with Aftermath Analyst, Town Greeter, even better stats in some ways. And then yes, you're paying a little more mana than Velgavoth Faithful, both to reanimate and to cast it, but you're getting a better body and the mill out of it, which I think makes up for it. So I think this card can see play in reanimation decks. We already see Velgavoth Faithful in some reanimator decks, Zombify. So if your deck that's just trying to fill your graveyard, get stuff back, this seems like a really big addition. It also seems good in just like Insidious Root style decks, just where you're milling some stuff. Sure, in Roots, you might not have the best reanimation targets, but that's fine because you're playing it for the mill 3, and then in the late game, if you're like, all right, I can sack this and get back an Overlord of the Baelmerk or whatever, you're kind of fine with that. So I think essentially any graveyard style deck is going to be interested in this card. It also seems like a good commander card in a couple of different ways. So first, it's a good insect, and insects can use all the help they can get. So if you're playing Zask Squittering Swarmlord or Grist the Hunger Tide, you're probably playing this because they're insect decks that care about your graveyard, so it fits right in there. But it also just seems like a good addition to any graveyard. If you're playing like Sidisi Broodtyrant or Madrolth of the Gravetide or Slimefoot and Squee, I think this card is at least worth considering because it fills your graveyard, it gets something back from the graveyard. I'm actually kind of blown away at just like how efficient this card is. It's got a good rate. I mean, a 2-mana 2/3, fine stats. It's got 2 different good abilities. It's got a relevant creature type for commander. So Seedship Broodtender, I expect this one to show up in a lot of standard graveyard decks and be really good in commander. We also got Reroute Systems, which is kind of an interesting best of 1 card. So a 1-mana instant. This is choose 1. Target artifact or creature gains indestructible until end of turn, or it does 2 damage to target tap creature. So Reroute Systems, it's kind of like a slightly worse Elspeth Smite mixed with a slightly worse Blacksmith skill, but I think the fact that you can add both of those effects together on 1 card is actually really powerful, especially in best of 1, where you can't really afford to play like narrow effects on their own. But even in best of 3, this is a card that can protect your creature, so you can play this in a deck that wants to protect your creature, but it can also be removal against aggro, or you can play this to remove aggro creatures and then get the upside of randomly being able to protect one of your creatures. So I think Reroute Systems, to me, has a look of a card that in the right meta could actually be a pretty powerful option, just thanks to its flexibility. Of course, we also got a bit of draft chaff that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Edge of Eternity spoilers for today. So I know not the biggest spoiler day, but I figured it'd be worth it to wrap it up. Week number 1 in the books, get all the cards out of the way, and then we can start fresh again on Monday, when not only do we start week 2 of spoiler season, but we also have our exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card to show off. So make sure to come back for that on Monday. Anyway, until then, everyone, let me know what you're thinking about the cards. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic Queen? Find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Much Brew, where we found out what absurd things Vivi can do in Modern Hollow 1.